After I wrote this speech, I got a bit more feedback. Someone said, look, I actually think Brooke's too cool for ACT. Which just added to the vitriol that Brooke has mentioned that I regularly cop. I'm biased, but I think that Brooke is the government's most quietly effective minister. Your labour law reforms, Brooke, are making it easier to employ workers and to be employed and get ahead. Your minimum wage increases are announced early to give business and workers alike certainty and relief. And you're taking on two of the hardest chestnuts in the workplace, holiday pay and health and safety. And you're doing it by actually going out and listening to the people affected. Something that may seem obvious, but I can tell you is not normal in Wellington. Brooke's put together an honest Royal Commission on COVID-19. She's got wait times down for new passports and citizenships, all while growing respect as a hard-working local MP here in the Tamaki electorate. It's easy to forget that Brooke is 32. I think she has the biggest future in New Zealand politics. And thank you. There is, of course, one problem with mentioning one ACT MP, because actually they're all kicking goals with both feet, and so you end up having to mention the lot. Nicole McKee, I know how she feels missing the flight not taking off. I actually ran into Greg Foran from Air New Zealand a while back. I said, Greg, I got to thank you, mate. He said, what for? And I said, well, I would have missed 3 flights last week if they were on time. The poor guy, he is doing his best. So it's a shame Nicole couldn't be here. But there's other things that she is making work faster, and that is speeding up the court system, rewriting the entire Arms Act to balance the rights of licensed firearm owners and the safety of New Zealanders, which has actually got worse under Labour's laws. She's reforming the anti-money laundering laws so people can actually get more business done and fewer forms filled out to do it. Andrew Hoggard is handling the country's biosecurity with his big farmer's hands, and he does it effortlessly, preventing potential outbreaks while he deals to the significant natural areas that erode farmers' property rights and corrects the very naive treatment of methane that has held back New Zealand's interests in climate policy. But the reason Andrew's able to do that is in large part because of the work that Mark Cameron did and continues to do. From 2020 onwards, he scared the bejesus out of every other party in rural New Zealand and shifted the entire political spectrum to the right on the split gas approach to methane, on those significant natural areas, on freshwater laws. And now we've elected a government that is changing those policies. And as chair of the Primary Production Committee, Mark stays in the headlines championing the rural New Zealand that he loves every week. I think he's the definition of an effective MP. And then I see Karen Chua, who I call the embodiment of ACT values. Now, Karen has told a lot of her life story, and it gives her more excuses than anyone in Parliament, but she makes none. And if you're an Oranga Tamariki staffer, you'll know she accepts none. She's reforming the government department that let her down when she was small. And if every New Zealander had Karen's attitude and values, we'd probably be a country with no problems by now. But perhaps the biggest single policy problem that this country faces on unlocking its potential is the Resource Management Act. Now, I once heard someone say, you can fill a town hall to stop anything in this country, but you can't fill a telephone box to get something started. So in steps Simon Court, who, along with Chris Bishop, is designing new resource management laws based on property rights. And that's an ACT policy designed to unleash our country's latent wealth by letting people develop and use the property that they own. Then there's our new MPs that you helped elect last year, also making their marks. Todd Stevenson, the pocket rocket, has picked up the end-of-life choice baton with a bill to extend compassion and choice to those who suffer the most, those with long-term degenerative diseases. Or Paramjit Parmar, Parliament's most qualified MP, Dr. Paramjit Parmar, I should say, but also one of the hardest working and a great chair of the Economic Development, Science and Innovation Committee that is so key to the government's economic growth strategy. Meanwhile, Cam Luxton, Laura McClure speak to a new generation of young parents who want their children to grow up in a free society. If you gave your party vote to ACT in 2023, you can be proud of the New Zealanders that you've put in Parliament to represent you. And I'm proud to lead this team of free thinkers in our House of Representatives. I think that we can all be proud of the efforts of this great team. Speaking of summer, it's a good time to think about the state of our nation. Myself, I got to thinking about who we are and how we got here. And whatever troubles we may face today, I couldn't help but thinking about something that unites New Zealand. You see, our country at its best is a place that welcomes hopeful people from all over the earth. People with different languages, different religions and cultures, united by one thing. When you look at the map, you can't help but notice it. We are the most remote country on earth. And if you've never stood at Cape Reinga and looked out to see the wide open space for 10,000 kilometres in every direction, you owe it to yourself just once, because it shows that one thing that makes all of us different from the rest of the world. No matter where or when you came from, your ancestors once travelled farther than anyone to give your children and theirs a better tomorrow. That is the true Kiwi spirit, to take a leap into the unknown for a chance at better. And compared with the things that divide us, our spirit as a nation of pioneers unites us 10 times over. Migrating from oppression and poverty to freedom and prosperity, that is what it means to be Kiwi. And if that bright and optimistic side of our psyche got half as much time as the whinging, we would all be much happier and better off. We could see ourselves as people unafraid of challenges, freed from conformity with the power to decide that our best days are always ahead of us. And then, because it's a Kiwi thing, I got to wondering why that isn't a more popular story. Why is it that we cut down tall poppies? Why do we value conformity over truth? And why do people who came here for a better life grow up disappointed and move away again? And we've just seen record figures from Statistics New Zealand. I believe our nation, at its heart, has long been dominated by two invisible tribes with different attitudes and values towards life. One I call change makers. Those are people who act out the pioneering spirit that built our country every day. We don't just believe it's possible to make a difference in our own lives, we actually believe it's an obligation. Change makers load up their mortgages to start a business, help other people find their way to a job. We work the land to feed the world. We save up, we buy a home, then maintain it and allow someone else to live in it. We study hard to extend ourselves so that we can reach our goals and dreams. We take each person as we find them. We volunteer and help out where we can. We don't need to know someone's ancestry before we decide how to treat them. And for all of that, too often we get vilified, beaten down and called all sorts of names. Now I know there's many people like that in this room today. ACT people are change makers. We carry that pioneering spirit in our hearts and we act it out in our heads. And then there's the other tribe. People I describe as building a majority for mediocrity. They would love nothing more than another lockdown, make some more sourdough, worry about the billions in debt another day. And they blame one of the most successful societies in history for every problem that they have. They believe that ancestry is destiny. They believe people are responsible for things that happened before they were born, and yet criminals are not responsible for things that they did just last week. And far from believing people can make a difference in their own lives, they believe that their troubles were somehow caused by other people's successes. So they seek out politicians who'll cut down tall poppies, politicians who say to young New Zealanders, you know what, you study hard, you get good grades, you get a job, save money and invest wisely. You know what, we'll tax you harder. On the other hand, if you do nothing, we'll give you free money. And I wasn't kidding when I brought up the lockdowns. They were actually a litmus test, in my view, for these two tribes. In early 2022, this beautiful city had been locked down for months. The borders had been closed for 2 years. And a pollster asked New Zealanders if they'd like to be locked down again for an Omicron outbreak. Now, I actually thought hard about whether to include this part of my speech because it's painful to think back to these times. However, bear with me. Well, remember Omicron spread more easily than any earlier variant. It was also less harmful if you caught it. And that was especially so because New Zealanders were at that point among the most vaccinated people on earth. The damage that had already been done to business, to education, to non-COVID healthcare, to the government's books were already massive and painful. And yet here's the result of that poll. 48% of New Zealanders said actually they would like another lockdown to stop Omicron. That left 46% who didn't. Two attitudes and two tribes, and it put it for me into very sharp relief. If you were a business owner who needed to open, a parent worried about missed education, a migrant missing their family, or just someone who wanted their life back, you wanted open. And when the government finally did lift the restrictions, many of those people did leave. Real estate agents even today report people are selling because they're moving to Australia nearly every day of the week. And this is where the balance between these two invisible tribes becomes important. Remember the gap in that poll, 48 to 46, a 2-point gap. Since the borders opened, a net 116,000 citizens have left this country. That's a touch over 2%. The more people that choose to get up and go, choose to get up and leave with their get up and go, the less attractive it is for motivated people to stay here. Now, there's a guy who used to represent the Tāmaki electorate. I have to say, I think Tāmaki's much better represented these days. But he once quipped, New Zealanders who leave for Australia raise the IQ of both countries. And I doubt many people in this room would remember him, but nonetheless. But actually, New Zealanders who leave for Australia are tipping us towards a majority for mediocrity. Motivated New Zealanders leaving is great news for the shoplifters, conspiracy theorists and jandal makers who make up the political opposition. They just need a few more good people leaving till they've got that majority for mediocrity. And the more that aspirational, hard-working people get up and leave this country, the more likely it is we'll get left-wing governments in future. And that's why I say we're at a tipping point. And there's another reason why the mediocrity majority is growing. It's because young people feel betrayed and disillusioned. A new generation looks at the housing market and they look out for hope and they find it hard to see. Now you imagine you're someone who's done it all right, you listened to your teacher, you did your homework, you studied for a tertiary education like everyone told you to do, and now the average debt for someone with a bachelor's degree is $34,000. You start on maybe $60,000 and you find out the average house is $900,000 or 15 times your income before tax and student loan repayments. No one can blame a young person for wondering if they're not better off overseas, and more decide that they are. And I was talking about this speech to someone just yesterday, and they said, yeah, my son's 23. He left. The thing that amazed me is he left in a group of 45 as soon as the borders opened. Those who stay on have been infected by universities with the woke mind virus of identity politics, Marxism and postmodernism. And if you feel like you'll never own a capital asset at the same time that some dusty Cold War relic of a professor tells you about this guy called Marx, that's a very dangerous combination. And this is the other political tipping point. that risks manufacturing that majority for mediocrity. A bad housing market, a woke education system combined are a production line for left-wing voters. The hard left prey on them. They tell young New Zealanders that their problems are caused by other success, that they're held back by their identity. But if they embrace identity politics, they can take back what's theirs. And their mechanism, for the most part, is new taxes on wealth. These are the opposite, the absolutely diametrically opposed opposite of the spirit that brings New Zealanders to our shores in the first place. The state of our nation is that we're at a tipping point, and what we do in the next few years will decide which way we go. The short-term outlook is actually relatively sunny, but only because Labour was so bad. I think we can afford to hope that 2025 will be better than last year. By that standard, compared with 2024, it will be a success. Interest rates will be lower, the government will have stopped wasting borrowed money, banning things, punishing employers, landlords, farmers, and punishing anyone else trying to make a difference with another layer of red tape. No, that's all stopping. In fact, we'll have a government that's saving money, a government that's cutting red tape and paring back identity politics in our institutions. And with those changes, we will see more hope and hopefully a slowdown in citizens leaving. All of that is good. It's welcome, and ACT is proud to be a part of the coalition government that's doing it, and I would argue making more than our fair share of contribution to the real change that this government's bringing. But, thank you. But the truth is, though, the Standard can't be doing a better job than Labour. It's much harder to muster the courage to keep making difficult decisions over several years, even if they're not immediately popular. Our nation, so far, sad to say, is in a century of decline. And just stopping one government's really stupid stuff and waiting for a cyclical recovery won't change that long-term trend. We need to be honest about the challenges we face and the changes needed to overcome them. We need to act like a country at risk of tipping and losing its first world status. We're facing some tough times, and that will inevitably require tough choices to be made. ACT's goal is to keep the government we have, but also make it better. We may have gone into government, but we never went into groupthink. It's the role of ACT to be the squeaky wheel pointing out where the government can and must do better. The government can't measure itself simply by improving on Labour. Instead, we need to ask ourselves, is this policy good enough to make New Zealand a first world country that people want to stay in? Because it's easy to have big plans. We are the world, but charity begins at home. And as a government, we must focus only on what government does and ensure that it does those things well. We need to think carefully about three areas of activity. There's spending money taxed off people, owning things the government's bought, and regulating the property that it hasn't already expropriated. There is nothing government does that doesn't fit into one of those three areas. Why the government spends a dollar it is taxed or borrowed, and whether the benefits of that tax outweigh its costs. Why the government owns an asset, and whether the benefits to citizens outweigh the costs to taxpayers of owning it. And why a restriction is placed on the use and exchange of private property, and whether the benefits of that regulation outweigh the cost on the property owner. When it comes to spending, we have a burning platform. Last year the economy shrunk by 1%, even as the population grew slightly thanks to births and New Zealanders continuing to choose us as a new home. This year the government's planning to borrow $17 billion, about $10 billion for interest on debt, and will have to pay interest on that debt the following year. Next year, government debt will exceed $200 billion, and yet there's reasons why the situation will get harder. We as New Zealand have claimed an exclusive economic zone of 4 million square kilometres by drawing a circle around every offshore island we could name. Quite smart. And yet we spend less than 1% of GDP defending it, while our only true ally across the ditch is spending over 2% of GDP. And put another way, we're a country where a government gives out $45 billion in transfer payments each year, but spends $3.2 billion defending the joint. I don't think that sounds prudent. And if you start confronting what it would mean to double defence, it's about another $3.2 billion a year. We're effectively paying twice as much for what we've taken for granted. Now, we may face pressure to do just that, thanks to US foreign policy. You already see it happening, ramping up in Europe. There's another tailwind on balancing the books, and one that affects every developed country. Our population is ageing faster than it's growing. Every year, around 60,000 people turn 65 and become eligible for a pension. To the taxpayer, superannuation expenses increase by $1.4 billion each year. Healthcare spending has gone from $20 billion to $30 billion in 5 years. But people are so dissatisfied that healthcare is now the third biggest political issue. Or put it another way, we're now spending $6,000 per citizen on healthcare, almost. How many people would give up their right to the public healthcare system if they got a $6,000 contribution to private insurance? Perhaps we should allow people to opt out of the public healthcare system and take their portion of the funding with them for that sort of scheme. And I know there are people that say, that is so radical. Well, actually, that is how most European systems, whether it's France or Switzerland or Germany, operate. I think if we're going to maintain first world status and reach our goals, we need to be prepared to say, we spent 20 billion, now we spend 30 billion, 10 billion more in the last 5 years. People still aren't very happy. How do they do it in Switzerland? Time to start asking, are there better ways to do things? And you can make the same argument with education. Our education budget is $20 billion. Each year, with remarkable consistency, New Zealanders produce 60,000 children. Now, by my count, this may point to my own education, that's $333,000 of lifetime spending on education for every citizen. Now, if you ask yourself, are you sure that every person you've met has truly benefited from $333,000 worth of education? Or put it another way, how many people or parents would take that 333 grand and could do a better job paying for their own education? How many young New Zealanders would be better off if we did it that way? And instead of spending next year, because, hey, we spent the same last year, we need to start asking ourselves, if we want to remain a first world country, then do New Zealanders get a return on this spending that justifies taking the money off taxpayers in the first place? Or could there be a better way? If the spending doesn't stack up, we should stop so we can repay debt or spend the money on something that does. So that's the spending activity. But then you come to owning assets. And you may be interested to know that the government has $500 billion plus of assets, $570 billion on its books. And the one thing we know from observing state houses, attempts to build and maintain hospitals, owning a number of farms with high levels of animal death, is that the government is probably the worst entity at owning things in the entire country. But did you know, for example, as a citizen and taxpayer of this country, you actually own Quotable Value, which is a property valuation company chaired by a former race relations conciliator that contracts to the government of New South Wales to value properties. Did you know we own 60,000 homes? We know that the government doesn't need to own a home to house someone because it manages to spend billions of dollars subsidising people to live in homes that it doesn't own every year. On the other hand, we're paying $10 billion a year in interest servicing the debt, while Kiwi Build and Kāinga Ora show that probably government should try to do as little as possible when it comes to houses it owns and builds itself. There are greater needs for government capital. I look at this beautiful harbour. We haven't managed to build a crossing over it for 7 decades. And I was thinking about this. There will be quite a number of New Zealanders who were born after the Harbour Bridge was built and are no longer with us. It now literally takes a lifetime to get infrastructure in this country. There are 400 people, sadly, who die every year on a substandard road network. Beaches, as Brooke will tell you, and I know too because Epsom electorate next door has a lot of beachfront, get closed thanks to sewage overflows. And yet we actually need more pipes and more pumping stations. Yet sections of the city are being red zoned from having more homes built because Watercare cannot afford those pipes and pumping stations. We need to get past the squeamishness. And I knew it as soon as we released this speech. There's massive reporting about the big P word. Everyone gets squeamish, says privatisation. We actually need to start asking ourselves, are we making the best use? See, Mikey Sherman just wrote down, she's going to use that on 6 o'clock tonight. Guarantee it. There you go. But that's the thing, right? We need a higher standard of debate. We've got $570 billion worth of assets. Are we getting a return on it? That's the question. $500 billion. And if something isn't getting a return, maybe we should sell it and buy something else that will. I think our future demands it and deserves it. And finally, there's the activity of regulation. So the government taxes money and spends it. Sometimes it taxes it and buys things. But there is some property that's been left and owned by you, New Zealanders, that's private property. And regulation is really the act of placing restrictions on the use of an exchange of private property. And that is, if you look at what we're really trying to get to here, one of the most damaging things that government can do. That is putting restrictions on the use and exchange of your property. And in particular, I believe bad regulation kills our prosperity in 3 ways. It's adding to the costs of the things we do. It's the delays, it's the paperwork, it's the fees that make too many activities cost more than they ought to. It's the builder who says it takes longer to get the consent than actually build the thing. It's the anti-money laundering palaver that ties people in knots doing basic things, but somehow doesn't stop criminals getting $500 million worth of P into the country each year. Who's doing their AML? It's the daycare. It's the daycare centre that took 4 years to open because different government departments couldn't agree on the level of road noise outside. This is a particularly good one, actually. I was slightly off script, but it was a daycare centre in a new subdivision, and there was lots of noise because lots of trucks were going past to build the place. And after 4 years of bureaucratic arguing, they did some more tests and they discovered that actually there weren't really any more trucks because the suburb had been completed. However, they'd had 4 years with no daycare centre. You can't make this up. We are fixing that one, incidentally. Then there's all the things that just don't happen because people hear these stories. They have prior experiences and they come to the conclusion that actually it's just not worth it. And that leads to the big one that goes to the heart of our identity and our Kiwi spirit. It's all the kids who grow up in a country where people gave up or weren't allowed to try. It's the climbing wall at Sir Edmund Hillary's old school that now has signs saying don't climb. It's the lack of vibrancy, that's a true story, I'm sorry to say. It's the lack of vibrancy in our nightlife because it's just so hard to get a liquor licence. I mean, we treat people trying to run a pub like the sort of, Al-Qaeda. It's just got to stop. And it's the fear that comes from worrying that WorkSafe or some other regulator will keep coming around until they shut you down. You can't measure that fear, but we know that it's there. And the Kiwi spirit that we're so proud of is being chipped away, or some people would put it, it's killing our vibe. Nobody migrated here to be compliant, but compliance is infantilizing our culture. And I haven't even mentioned, you'll notice, orange cones. That was a whole piece about regulation of bureaucracy. Didn't even have to use the go-to. That's how bad it's got. And if we want to remain first world, then we must change how we regulate. No law should be passed without showing what problem is being solved, whether the benefits outweigh the costs, who pays the costs and who gets the benefits. Those happen to be the basic principles of the Regulatory Standards Bill that the government is going to pass this year. Now, of course, I've raised a lot of problems. The truth is the government is doing many things that will change how it operates, how our economy grows and our society prospers. There is a huge drive to reduce waste. There is a drive to get more money from overseas investment. There is a Regulatory Standards Bill that will change how we regulate. The Resource Management Act is being replaced. Anti-money laundering laws are being simplified, and some fabulous charter schools are being opened while new roads are being built. These are all fabulous things and a welcome change from the last 5 years. These are why it is so absolutely critical that we keep the opposition out and make the government we have the best it can be. But make no mistake, beyond and beneath everyday politics, our country has always been the site of a battle between those two different invisible tribes with different attitudes and values towards how we can make a difference in our own lives and the future of our country. And the effect of immigration, the uphill battle faced by young New Zealanders, risks creating a tipping point towards a permanent majority for mediocrity. We need honest conversations about why government spends, it owns and regulates, and whether those policies are good enough to secure our future as a first world nation that generations to come will buy into. Now, you may have also seen the ACT Party has been involved in a battle to define the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi democratically. It has caused quite a stir. If you have missed this, please check out treaty.nz, where you can catch up and find out what it's all about. You laugh, actually. Many of the people opposed haven't done that. I think it's well worth looking at. It may, if you want to oppose it, that's fine, but read a little bit about it first. It may still succeed this time, or it may be one of those bills that simply breaks the ground so something like it can proceed in the future. Remember euthanasia. The first bill was Michael Law's in 1995, went down in a screaming heap. It was nearly 25 years before I was able to legalise it. I'm not saying it should take that long, but I am saying that just about every major change has had multiple bills. William Wilberforce's first anti-slavery bill was in 1792. The first homosexual law reform bill was in 1972. It took 14 years. Either way, the tribe of changemakers now has a voice on this issue. People who want equal rights for all New Zealanders. People who want to be treated with respect and dignity because they're citizens, but more importantly because they're human beings, have a position that others need to refute. And good luck to them, arguing against equal rights and the universal humanity that is in each of us to be treated the same in front of the law regardless of who our ancestors were. But it also shows something else. It shows that ACT is a party that's prepared to stand up when it's not easy and when it's not popular. It's interesting, Brooke said I take a lot of vitriol, and that's partly true, but also kind of not true. Because I got to tell you, while lots of people have been calling me names, I mean, that started in kindy. That's not new. And a lot of people have been very abusive. What I haven't seen is one person stand up and say, you know what, I respect you and your right to have the debate. We just think our society would be better if there were two categories of people with a different role to play in our constitutional setup. And here's why we think that. You just don't hear it. So in a sense, I haven't actually had a glove laid on me, and I actually wish that someone would come up with such an argument. The best I've heard is that our model should be American-style Indian reservations. I'm not sure, based on my knowledge of North America Indigenous relations, that's quite where we want to go. But at least that person tried. To all the change makers, meanwhile, those who proudly put us here, thank you. And no matter how daunting this tipping point may feel, together, we in this room and those who share our values up and down this country have the power to ensure, through the choices we make, that our best days in this country are still ahead of us. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.